So today with Rebel Justice, we've got Pia Sinha, who is an extraordinary individual who has contributed massively to prisons within the UK, starting from being a psychologist at prisons and youth offending institutes and making her way to becoming a governor for multiple prisons in the UK, now being the CEO of Prison Reform Trust. Pia, would you like to tell the audience about your career journey and, what inspired you to first work with prisons in the first place?
Well, thank you, Louise, and thank you for having me. I joined the prison service in 1999, so nearly 27 years ago. And my journey started as a psychologist. I finished my qualifications as a psychologist. I got chartered as a counseling psychologist, and I was looking for work. And at the time, I lived in North London, and there were vacancies in Holloway Prison, which was at the time the largest women's prison in the country. And I applied to be a psychologist. I'd never worked with people who had been impacted by the criminal justice system. Prior to this, I had worked within a sort of substance misuse counseling service. So I had some contact, but very sort of adjacent contract. But I then, started working in Holloway Prison, and it was my first sort of experience of working inside a prison. And I guess that people who work in prisons, who will be listening to this podcast, who have experience of being inside prison, it's very quickly whether you can work in that environment or not. And fortunately for me, the work and the people that I worked with, the clients that I had, it felt immediately very, very immersive and gripping. And that's how I started my journey in prisons. And I've continued to work in prisons in various forms and in various roles all the way until 2023.
Well, it sounds like such an inspiring journey, and you've worked in so many different positions. What do you feel like has shocked you the most within working in prisons?
They've all been really pivotal, I think, in shaping who I am as a person and who I am as a professional. So I started my journey into prisons when I was quite young, relatively young. I was in my late 20s, and that's quite a sort of formative time in your life. And I was influenced a lot by my experiences as a youngish psychologist, working with women who had come into prison with very, very tragic stories themselves. And it's hard not to be affected by what you hear, and it gives you an insight into some of the kind of lives that people have, and I think that impact stays with you. It can't not stay with you. And I think that with that comes a realization that justice is a strange thing, because I would say that, many of the women that I worked with, in fact, most of them really shouldn't have been in prison, that they should have been supported, helped, looked after much early on in their lives. And had they had those opportunities earlier on in life, perhaps they wouldn't have been in prison. And I think that instills a strong sense of what's right, what's wrong. And that then becomes some of the kind of values that drive you to do certain things. And I think that for me, having had that experience of working as a psychologist, both with men and women, I suppose that was the motivation to try and, make systems that hold people in the criminal justice system, especially our prisons, safer, fairer, more humane, because ultimately prison offers a reset for people when they're in there. And unless those prisons are humane and fair and procedurally just, that opportunity for people to turn their lives around kind of disappears. And I think that it became really important for me that whilst I operated in those systems, that what I did was to try and, further those aims.
Yeah, that's so true. I think a lot of people tend to think of prisons as this sort of lengthy punishment and that's it, that's your life over. But it's very true. You need to emphasize, rehabilitation and resetting in a new chapter in your life. Was that while you were part of, as an advisor to the UK government's Women Justice Board, was that sort of your main priorities, or was that anything else that you wanted to focus on?
Well, it was a real honour to be asked to be on the Women's Justice Board, and it's for that reason because, the sad thing is that 27 years ago, when I started working as a psychologist in Holloway, the issues that led to women coming into prisons were still remain largely the same, that there was an injustice as to why women were coming into prison, and that, if there was, as I said before, greater investment, earlier on in their lives, then they perhaps wouldn't be there. And so working or being invited to be part of the Women's Justice Board was a real opportunity to see how I might be able to influence that happening, because it's something that has been a problem and a concern for as long as I can remember. In fact, throughout my entire career, and it still persists as a problem. So it was about looking at how I could use my experience and my knowledge of the system, and also direct experience of working with the women to influence change at a policy level, but also at a legal level.
Now, focusing on sort of, obviously, your company, what does Prison Reform Trust do? Would you like to tell us a bit more about
Sure. So the Prison Reform Trust is a charity, and it has been in operation for nearly 45 years. And it's a charity that was set up at the time with the main principles or aims of enabling and influencing a more fair and humane and effective prison system. At the time, the population was probably, 40,000. And it was set up on the principles that, we were sending too many people into prison, and that while they were in prison, they weren't necessarily being looked after in the way that they should, that their rehabilitation wasn't something that was being focused on. And the charity still remains fighting that cause. It's about trying to influence various people that are interacting with the criminal justice system towards more reform agendas. And so whether that's influencing parliamentarians and ministers to bring in more reform-oriented legislation or policies, whether it's working with officials that work within the prison and probation service or the Ministry of Justice to try and, give them some insight into how the policies and practices within prisons and probation are impacting people. But also we work directly with people who are experiencing incarceration, whether that's in the prison or in the community, to hear from them about their experiences, to bring their voice into the debate and amplify their voices. So, no one knows better what their experience is, other than the people who are going through it themselves. And it's about trying to say that their views, their solutions, their strategy, their leadership is vitally important when we're trying to shape policies that affect them. So we have quite a strong link with people in prisons themselves and their families, so that we can help them inform the debate. And finally, we also speak to practitioners, frontline practitioners, prison leaders, who are providing that level of management in prisons and probation, so that we can influence them towards doing better work so that they ultimately improve the lives of the people that they're looking after. And the final strand is our research work. So we have quite a strong research focus, and our publications, our briefing reports, because they are so well triangulated, are really is the medium through which we communicate to all of those people who work within the criminal justice system about what works, what doesn't work, what should happen. And the rigor of that research is what gives us our credibility.
Well, I mean, you can, just listening to what you said, you can clearly see how important your work is and how much I'm sure they contribute to the lives of those currently in prison and coming out of prison. Do you feel, and you were saying about how an important part of it is actually listening to those within prison and listening to those lived experiences. Do you feel like those in charge of improving the welfare of offenders are sufficiently listening to their lived experiences?
Well, I think that in the time that I've been in the criminal justice system, things have got incrementally better. I think that there is an absolute recognition that people with lived experience need to inform the debate and influence the debate. But I worry that at the moment, those methods are slightly tokenistic, that they want it to happen, but they are not fully willing to engage in it in a meaningful way. So there is progress, I would say, but there's so much more that can be done. I think that there are some really genuinely interested practitioners, officials who want that voice to be stronger, but we don't practice what we preach, So if we say that people with lived experience need to be employed, for example, when they're released, they need to have employment opportunities so that they can break the cycle of their reoffending. The first thing that the Ministry of Justice needs to do is to have a stronger pipeline of employing ex-offenders. I think that is one of the clearest signals that they are genuinely interested. And I know that there are risks that come with it, but risks are there to be managed. And so long as risks are managed in an appropriate way, there is no reason why people with lived experience can't be, really meaningfully employed to shape the direction of travel.
And do you feel that the government, the services that they provide, do you feel like they should include charities and voluntary organisations within their decisions and policy making?
Well, they do to some extent. I think that charities like the Prison Reform Trust are influential in shaping policy. They are influential in shaping the journey any kind of legislation takes, because that's part of what we do. But at the end of the day, it can be a bit piecemeal. So in some cases it works, in some cases it doesn't work, but there is an ambition to do that, but whether that follows through in the reality is a slightly different matter.
As someone who has seen the prison system from so many different angles, how do you feel that the criminal justice system has improved to women over the past decade, and where do you feel like it has fallen short?
So I think that prisons themselves, so you've got the way that I see the criminal justice system, particularly in relation to women, but equally applies to men and children and young people, is three sections. So you've got pre-custody, you've got custody, and you've got post-custody. So in terms of what happens inside prisons, I think there have been improvements in terms of conditions, in terms of rights, in terms of staff and prisoner relationships, in terms of opportunities. So the standards have improved inside prison, not as much as they can. There's still lots to do, but they have improved in the last 27 years. That's without a shadow of a doubt. And in terms of pre-custody, which is the stuff that I think is crucial in preventing people coming into prison in the first place, there is a lot more that can be done. I think that with the work of the Women's Justice Board and this government and their kind of ambition to divert more women away from custody, I think that there is more that has been done, because we have got now a presumption against short sentences. The vast majority of women in the past would be given short sentences, and that's what made up the population of the women's prisons. But with this presumption, it means that more women will be diverted away, which means that they are more likely to get suspended sentences, deferred sentences, or community sentences. And that's good. And the legislation will help that happen. But the problem is that you have to invest in those alternatives. So simply saying that women will get a deferred sentence or a suspended sentence or community sentence isn't enough. What you need to do is invest in the services, the wraparound services that women need in order to make that more meaningful, because otherwise women will not succeed in those spaces, and then they will either reoffend because then their underlying issues are not being addressed, whether that's mental health or substance misuse or family relations or whatever conditions has led them to their offending. You have to really meaningfully have a whole system approach in the community in order to really stop that person reoffending. So those investments need to happen. And it's the same post-custody. So when a woman has been given a custodial sentence, there needs to be a lot of care and planning taking place about what happens on release. So many women are being released without housing. And you can imagine that if someone is being released without any supported or safe housing on release, they're back to being in a chaotic life. And that then leads them to kind of reiterate the cycle of reoffending. So I think that it's a very long answer, but what I'm saying is that yes, there have been improvements. However, you have to really go back to basics and build from the foundation up. You have to invest in services that are there to prevent women going into custody. And unless you do that, you're going to see the pattern reappear.
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about sort of the consequences of rough on crime approaches. If we were to look at alternatives to custody and prison defiances, if you could redesign the system from scratch, what would you think would work best for women?
I think if I could redefine the system, the first thing I would do is, first thing is early intervention. So what investment is being made at kind of preschool level to identify vulnerability, and how are we managing and looking after children at that age, whether they're boys or girls, because that's kind of where everything starts, right? That will be my first step. But along the pipeline, it's kind of looking at what other opportunities you have at every step of the way to prevent someone getting into the trap of offending in the first place. And then if all of those gates have not worked for whatever reason, the real investment needs to be in those kind of community kind of opportunities. So what is being done to provide meaningful housing, safe housing for women? A lot of women have experienced domestic violence in their homes, and it's kind of what alternatives are there for them. So bricks and mortar alternatives. But that in itself is not enough. What wraparound support does that woman need? Do they have substance misuse problems? Do they have mental health problems? Do they need connecting with their children? Do they need secure employment? Do they need proper sources of income so that they can sustain and be independent if they need to be? All of that needs to be addressed in a sort of meaningful way. So what I would do is to make sure that the systems that provide that, and it has to be kind of holistic, the systems that provide that are fully resourced so that when a woman is at risk of encountering contact with the criminal justice system, that they have suitable places for them to go so that that help can be accessed at a much early point.
Yes. I mean, yeah, you were talking about how about intervening really early. And I think a lot of women that tend to go into crime do struggle with poverty, addiction, previous trauma. How do you feel like that sort of intersects with women's experiences when they're in the criminal justice system?
So that all of those experiences make people very distrustful of authority. So if you've had a lifetime, especially if that journey started when you were a child, of being let down by professionals and being let down by the system, you are going to be suspicious of anyone who claims to help and then hasn't. And you also are risking re-traumatizing individuals. So all of those factors prevent meaningful engagement. And I think that you have to work really hard at making those spaces safe, psychologically safe, and trauma informed. We use the word trauma informed quite as a panacea, and people don't often understand what that really means. Essentially, it's about creating an environment for individuals where they feel psychologically safe, and that that is procedurally fair for them. So when they are interacting with the system, it's a system that understands their individual needs and is doing all it can to minimize the triggers that people would face when they're interacting with that system. And that doesn't happen well enough in a lot of spaces. It's kind of tokenistic, and which is why people can fail when they're in those systems, because they don't trust them and they don't engage with them in the way that they could.
Yes, I think, it's very true. I think a lot of it just impacts a lot of mental health and sort of well-being. What more do you think can be done to improve the mental health of women in prisons?
Well, women in prison, so there's two groups, right? So when you're in prison, it's a different set of things that you need to do. And when you're in the community, it's a different set of things that you need to do. So, when you're talking about prevention, it's about what can be done in the community. And I think that comes with, providing a psychologically informed environment. It's providing one-to-one counseling and interventions that are about understanding the individual needs of that individual. So mental health treatment orders, drug treatment orders, these are really useful interventions that help the person really kind of get the support that they need to understand the sort of, the kind of reasons why they have committed the offences in the first place. And so if those interventions are well provided, then that stops or can prevent women from, committing further crime and ending into custody. When they're in custody, you need good psychological interventions that are actually tailored to the needs of women. So what women need in terms of psychological help is often quite different from what men need. And part of what happens in custody is that you have interventions that are designed for men, and women are seen as a bit of an afterthought. So either they're the right interventions for them, or they're not eligible for them, or they're not sensitive enough to the needs of women. So what you need to do in prison is that you need to design interventions that really address the bespoke needs of women. And to be fair, you do have a lot of very good, unique interventions that are happening inside custody within the women's estate that do address these needs. So there's a lot of learning that's taken place over the years that says that this intervention is quite tailored to the needs of women. And that's the kind of key word, that they do need to be individualized and tailored to the needs of women.
If we focus on once they have left prison, once they're ready to set on to that new chapter, do you feel like there is adequate support for offenders once they have left prison?
Well, no, I think, and that's part of the kind of challenge, isn't it? So all of these services, which are pre and post custody, and we're talking about post custody now, are very dependent on a well functioning and a well resourced probation system. And it's a sort of interplay between probation and the third and voluntary sector, and they're the organizations that provide that support post custody. And what isn't happening is that you have currently within the probation system, you have a real staff issue. You've got too few staff. You've got the staff that do exist having enormous workloads, and you're at risk of being part of a system that becomes very process oriented. It's very much about kind of a sort of tick box process that as a way of managing people, as opposed to a relational way of managing people. Because after all, you do need to be able to understand the individual that you're trying to help, right? And if you don't have the time, and you're busy and you're rushed, and you're kind of overwhelmed by the work that you're doing, you're not going to be able to do that. And sometimes, so the problem becomes twofold. One is that you're not having sufficient time to plan what this person might need. So the plans are quite piecemeal. And then the second is that when they do come out, you don't have the time to really build that relationship and provide the support that people need. And in kind of with people who've committed offences, you've got two types of risk. One is the risk that they will reoffend, and the other is their need. So when you have people who've got low risks but they've got high levels of need, they need a different kind of support package to those who are high risk of offending. And all our attention, or all the attention of the practitioners, goes in helping to try and manage the highest risk of offending, but not necessarily the highest need. And the problem with that is that when people have their needs are unmet, they're likely to reoffend, and they become prolific offenders because their needs are not met.
So what do you feel are the main focuses right now that you're focusing on in the criminal justice system to try and sort of weave out and sort out?
Well, it's going back to our aims as a charity, so we kind of believe that fewer people should be in prison, that whenever possible, the opportunities, the kind of outcomes for the offences that people have committed need to just try and sit at the lowest level. So where it is, indicated that they should get community sentences, and when they're in the community, that those community resources are well resourced. When they're in prison, that they get the interventions that they need, that the conditions that they live in are humane and decent. And when they get released, that there's opportunities for rehabilitation, whether that is meaningful employment, safe housing, whether their mental health and substance misuse needs are addressed. So all of those kind of things across the justice system is what we advocate for as a charity, and that's what we will sort of continue to do. And our focus right now is on the Sentencing Act, because the Sentencing Act has been a really important lever for us to try and realize one of those aims, which is that you have divert people away from custody and provide them interventions and support in the community. And the other bit is that we continue to fight for better conditions and better rights for people who are in custody right now.
Would you say there's anything In particular, so for example, our charity was focusing on how women with cancer are treated within prisons, or how women who are pregnant, how the maternity care, how it's lacking thereof. What is there anything in particular that you're focusing on? Is it just as a whole?
Well, I think that we focus on it as a whole, but our sort of our mission as far as women are concerned is always about having fewer women in custody, and definitely about the fact that pregnant women that shouldn't be in custody, and that it's kind of, I think, taking a global view about what happens, so long as the aims are kind of clear. We continue to fight the cases as they come along. So if it is about poor conditions, we see that as something that we want to get behind. If it is about long sentences and people getting longer and longer sentences, that's something that we would fight for. If it is about the fact that people are kept in poor conditions, that's something that we would fight for. If it is that people are not being treated fairly or humanely, that's something that we would fight for. So it's kind of the kind of the reasons why we might interact with something would get triggered as soon as any of those aims are kind of fall short.
Is there anything that you feel like journalists or the media do not ask enough about, or do not show more about, regarding women in prison?
Well, if it's about women in prison, I think that there is generally more compassion for women, because there is finally a recognition and a realization that women are often victims of worse crimes than they have that they find themselves in prison for, and that it's a societal issue that we need to make sure that women are protected, and harm to women is prevented. So the sort of violence against women and girls is a really, really important agenda, and I think that the media need to get behind it, but make the connection between the violence that women experience and how that has an impact on the kinds of women that end up in the criminal justice system. So a greater awareness of the link between those two, and with that, greater awareness of what needs to be done to support women away and divert women away from custody.
Now, finally, what do you feel like listeners can do to contribute to yours and our sort of charity's cause and our aims?
Well, I think the first thing that people need to do is to get activated, is to care. So amongst all of the issues that we're kind of bombarded with, whether it's poor health services or poor education services or poor local amenities, it's a competition, isn't it, to say, well, what gets our attention? But I think the important thing for the general public is to kind of know that if they want to be part of safer communities, and everyone does, it's kind of almost number one on the agenda, that people want to feel safe for around where they live, and they want to be able to have their freedoms. And the route, one of the clearest route to having safer communities is also having a kind of well-functioning criminal justice system. And unless you are treating people who have committed crime in a way that allows them the opportunity to change their lives and to get a reset in their lives and to lead law-abiding lives, you have to invest in that criminal justice system. And whether that's all the way through, whether it's kind of better and more efficient policing, or better and more efficient court systems, or a better and more efficient probation system, or a more efficient prison system. All of these contribute to safer communities. And when you lose interest in how that system works, you then prevent, the opportunity that these systems play in creating, fewer reasons why people would commit crime. So when you are in prison, you are provided with an opportunity to reset your lives, and you have the opportunity when you come out to be better neighbors. And the public need to make that connection, that unless you have a high functioning criminal justice system, you are not going to get people that come out of that system being better neighbors. And that stops people from creating more harm in the community. So it's about taking an interest in it in the first place. And so I would say, read up about it. When there is an item on the news about it, take an interest to see and hear what people are saying. And there is a lot that goes on in communities that actually work, whether it's the voluntary sector or the statutory sector. Find out what is going on in your local community that helps support your local prison, for example. And there might be opportunities to volunteer and kind of see what you could do. If you're an employer, then have a look to see whether you would, employ someone who has come out of prison. And it feels like a high-risk strategy, but, you've seen with the work that Timpsons have done and Iceland have done and Greggs have done, they are now employers that actually take on people that have been affected by the criminal justice system. So, you can make a difference by kind of being more engaged in the system. Find out who your local MP is and campaign on behalf of the rights of people that are trapped in the criminal justice system. So it's all about, making what is a very hidden system, which is the prison system, become a bit more kind of visible to the world. And I think that if people might kind of say, well, people need to be punished and they've committed a crime, they need to be punished. Yes, they need to face consequences for things that they've done. But if you want them to come out of that system as people who are not going to commit more crime, you have to, take an interest in their lives and be invested in that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Pia, for coming on. I mean, it's been amazing having you, and just to have your insight has also been incredible.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.